Hello everyone, and welcome to the Darkest Hour. I'm your host, Amanda Jane. We're in the heart of the spooky season, just a week away from Halloween, a night where the line between worlds is said to be thin, where the crisp air hums with something out of reach. Is Halloween truly a night of tricks and treats? Or is it a time when things we fear most step out of the shadows? For some, it's just another day of the year. For others, it's their favorite time of year. And yes, there's a few who dread the holiday. Their experiences have taught them not to let their guard down, even on what some consider a silly holiday. It makes you wonder if the stories surrounding it are just legends, or if there's some truth to the day that's been celebrated and feared for centuries. Tonight, you'll hear stories from those who have encountered the unexplained on Halloween, chilling whispers, figures in the dark, and the moments when fear became reality. These tales go far beyond the playful frights. So, let's get started, shall we? Halloween 2002 started out like any other Halloween. My mom had let me go trick-or-treating with some of the neighborhood friends, just a few blocks around our quiet suburban neighborhood. I dressed as a pirate, complete with a plastic sword and a hat that kept slipping over my eyes. Back then, Halloween felt a little bit more magical. The costumes, the candy. I didn't know that it could turn into something dark. My friends and I went from house to house collecting candy in pillowcases, our laughter echoing down the street, I'm sure of it. But at some point we got separated. I don't even remember how it happened exactly. One minute we were all together, and the next I was standing alone at the end of a cul-de-sac, looking around, trying to figure out where everyone had gone. I wasn't scared at first. I was 9 and this was our neighborhood. I knew every street, every corner. But as I stood there in the growing darkness, I realized I didn't recognize the houses around me. They looked strange, the windows dark like no one was home. The streetlights were dim, barely cutting through the shadows. I started walking, trying to find my way back to the main street where all the other kids were. The further I walked, the more uneasy I felt. Every house I passed seemed abandoned. No decorations, no lights, no sounds of laughter or footsteps, just the crunch of leaves under my feet and the eerie silence that felt like it was closing in around me. And then I saw him. A man standing at the end of the street, under a streetlight. He was tall, wearing a long coat. His face was hidden by darkness. At first, I thought that he was just another parent, maybe waiting for his kid to finish trick-or-treating. But something about the way he was standing, so still and so quiet, it sent a chill through me. He wasn't moving. He wasn't doing anything. Just staring at me. I told myself not to be scared. It was Halloween after all. There were people everywhere just a second ago. But as I got closer, I realized the man wasn't just staring at me. He was staring through me. I couldn't see his eyes, but I felt him. I turned down another street instead of passing him, trying to shake the feeling that he was still watching me. I wanted to run, but I didn't want to look scared. I kept telling myself it was fine. I'd find my friends or someone soon enough. But the streets were still empty. No kids, no trick-or-treaters. Just house after house with the lights off, like everyone had suddenly decided Halloween was over. And then I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, crunching through the fallen leaves behind mine. I turned around and there he was, The man in the coat, closer now. His face was still hidden, but I could see the outline of his hat, the way his shoulders hunched forward slightly. He wasn't walking fast, just slow, steady, like he knew I had nowhere to go. My heart was racing in my chest. I started walking faster, but the footsteps behind me quickened too. I didn't know where I was going anymore. Every street looked the same, every house dark and unfamiliar. I broke into a run, and I could hear him running after me, his footsteps heavy and fast. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just ran as fast as I could, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My pirate hat was falling off as I sprinted down the street. I turned a corner and nearly stumbled when I saw it. A van parked at the end of the block. It was old, rusted, no windows on the sides, just a beat-up, ugly thing that looked like it hadn't moved in years. And then the side door slid open. A hand reached out and grabbed me by the arm, yanking me off the street so fast I didn't even have time to scream. I was pulled into the van, the door slamming shut behind me with a loud, final thud. Inside it was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the streetlights outside. The man who had grabbed me was tall, his face hidden under some sort of mask, something cheap and plastic. But all I could focus on were his eyes, cold, empty. He didn't say a word, just tied my hands with rope, rough and tight, and shoved me into the back of the van. I tried to kick and scream, but he gagged me with something that tasted like old. I could feel this panic rising. My heart was still racing. I thought for sure I'd pass out. I didn't understand. Why was this happening? Where were my friends? Where was anyone? The van started moving, the engine growling as it rolled down the street. I didn't know where we were going, and that terrified me more than anything. I was trapped, helpless, and the only sound was the hum of the engine and my own frantic breathing. I lost track of time. It felt like hours, maybe longer, but at some point the van stopped. The door slid open. The man dragged me out, tossing me on the ground. I landed hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. We were in the middle of nowhere. I could see trees, a gravel road, and the dark outline of an old abandoned building in the distance. This man stood over me, silent, his face still hidden behind that stupid plastic mask. I was so scared that I couldn't even cry. I just laid there, my body shaking, waiting for whatever was going to happen next. But then, something changed. I heard another sound. Sirens, distant at first, but getting louder. The man's head snapped up, and for the first time, I saw him hesitate. He looked down at me, then back at the road, and just like that, he turned and ran. I don't know how long I laid there before the police found me. They told me that someone had seen the van and called it in, but they never caught the man. He disappeared into the night, just as quickly as he'd shown up. But I was okay. I'm 30 now, and every Halloween since, I can't help but feel a chill when I see those empty streets, or those shadows that seem too still. I always wonder if he's out there, or whatever happened to him. I'm not 9 anymore, but some fears never go away. About 15 years ago, I was basically my parents' live-in nurse. One night, a couple of days before Halloween, I'm in my bedroom, and I hear my dad's pained wail type of scream. He had phantom pains from losing his leg, and they could get pretty intense at times. I heard it clear as day. It was louder than usual, but it was definitely the 10 out of 10 super bad phantom pain scream. I bolt up, run down the hall to my parents' bedroom. Empty. I look through the house and find them both watching TV in the living room. My dad looks perfectly fine. I asked if he screamed. He said he didn't, and neither of them heard anything. The TV wasn't loud enough to hear from across the house. Plus, they weren't watching anything that would have a scream like that. I think they were watching White Christmas. And the scream, it sounded almost like it was right next to me at the time. They swore up and down they didn't hear anything. That's probably the creepiest thing I'd ever experienced around Halloween. When I was about 13, I lived in a big house that was only about a mile removed from civilization, but surrounded by thick forest. It felt more remote than it was. There were no sidewalks and no streetlights, so it was never what you would call trick-or-treat friendly. It was too far of a walk on winding, hilly, pitch-black roads between homes. Most kids from our neighborhood went into the crowded downtown on Halloween. We were so rarely bothered by outsiders that many of our neighbors didn't even bother buying candy. A ringing doorbell would come as a genuine surprise. It did ring, though, a couple of times. Mostly early in the night by neighborhood kids who wanted us to see their costumes before they headed off to town. We'd hand out treats and admire their ingenuity, and then lock up and settle in for the night. On this Halloween, we went through the process of turning off the lights and making sure everything was secure. It was somewhere between 11 p.m. and midnight, long after trick-or-treating hours. Our Cocker Spaniel was whining, so we opened the front door to let him out one last time. The door swung open, and a full-grown man in a clown costume, complete with a grotesque mask, was standing silently on the front porch. Our dog saw the enormous clown shoes first, as his head slowly raised to take in the baggy striped pants, the cartoonish necktie, and finally, the hideous face. His haunches slowly lowered, and he peed a giant puddle on the floor. Terror-stricken, my parents slammed and locked the door. They raced through the house, making sure every door and window was locked. Then they peeped out from behind the living room curtain for several agonizing minutes until the clown turned and walked into the darkness. I honestly can't remember if they called the police. If I had been in their place, I would have. Why was he there? He was too old for trick-or-treating. He hadn't rung the doorbell. He hadn't knocked. He'd just stood on our porch without a word, staring at the door. We'd only seen him by chance when we let the dog out. What were his plans? He'd arrived on foot in full costume and never made a sound. We never saw if he had a weapon. Why would he do that? If he were some teenager getting an ill-advised thrill out of frightening the literal piss out of the locals, would he have been so patient as to wait in utter silence in front of a door that might not open? He was undoubtedly menacing, but the fact that it was happening on Halloween night introduced a dangerous level of self-doubt to our reactions. Were we overreacting? Is it normal for a man in a clown suit to stand staring at your front door on the off chance that you'll open it during the night? It would be years before I saw a few horror movies in which an unsuspecting family was stalked and tortured by people who arrived unannounced and masked at their homes in the dead of the night. My experience with the clown added a rich dimension of recognition and horror that I'd been much happier without. Those films gave me nightmares for months, and last winter, long after Halloween, we were returning home from a trip, driving along dark and utterly desolate country roads, when suddenly the headlights illuminated a man standing in a ditch. He was facing us, and waved at us as if he were expecting us all along. He had this almost cartoonish hair and makeup, looking like a genuine cartoon character. He had a guitar slung across his back. A guitar. He was dressed in a country western costume. You'd almost think that he was returning home from a gig and his car was broken down. The trouble with that explanation was that there was only soybean fields for miles. No little towns, no bars. We hadn't passed any stranded vehicles, and we wouldn't pass another car, operational or otherwise, until we got to the next town, 20 miles away. Still, that self-doubt kicks in. Was he hitchhiking? Was he signaling for help? No, that's the thing. He was standing in the ditch, pointed towards us as if he'd known that we were coming, with a wide smile of greeting spread across his heavily made-up face, and a leisurely wave to us as we passed. It was a friendly hello wave, not a call for help. That I'm absolutely sure of. There was no urgency in his demeanor at all. It was a ditch in the pitch black of night, in a soybean field, so far in the middle of nowhere that there were no other cars for miles. It was so unsettling at the time that we sped off. We had a young child in the car to protect. The scene was so bizarre that we began to think we'd hallucinated it. When I got home, I told a friend of mine about it, a news director for a radio station in the area. He quickly sent me a screen cap of a dispatch report. 2 motorists advised police of a heavily made-up man with a guitar jumping from a ditch into the road and running at the cars. So, apparently we didn't hallucinate him. It does terrify me beyond reason to think that not only do people wander in the darkness like this, but no one knows their true intentions or whether or not they're harmless. But there are apparently so many of them out there that one person, me, has had 2 late-night run-ins. Who else is out there? What are their plans? Do they rely on the Halloween second-guessing to take advantage of our split-second indecision? When I was 8 or 9, I went over to my friend's house to fool around for a few hours before a Halloween party, which we were going to be going together. In their backyard, his sister came up to me and asked where their dog was. They had a black chow chow, who was very docile. He was around 4 years old, but bigger than me. I showed her to the dog, and he was chewing on a bone. And then I made a huge mistake. I pointed to the dog, and in a split second, he went from chewing on the bone to chewing on my arm. I tried to run, but he had a vice grip on my arm. Eventually, he did let go. At the time, my friend's parents weren't home either, so his sister had to call 911. They ran inside and left me outside in the backyard with the dog, circling and growling at me. The maid came running outside, threw a chair at the dog, which made him back off. While sitting there, I felt strange. There was no pain. There was a ton of adrenaline in my system, but I just sort of felt at ease. I started to reflect on what had just happened. There was a lot of white stuff that looked like whipped cream, tissue, oozing from my wounds, and there was a ton of blood. Blood was everywhere, stained the concrete, the grass. Everyone was crying too. Paramedics arrived, and really, everything up until the ER was a blur. I had 6 cuts, 3 cuts on the inside and 3 on the outside of my forearm, 4 stitches for 2 cuts and 1 for 1, vice versa. More than 10 stitches for the inside of my arm, the muscle and whatnot. There were 20 or so stitches in total. The doc said that I was lucky to still have my arm, as the dog's mouth was just the right size that it missed several vital veins and arteries. It was very traumatic, but thankfully it didn't ruin our relationship. Funnily enough, I was back at his house a few weeks later, petting the dog again with a lot more caution. I think it's safe to say that we didn't go to the party later that night. When I was in college, I lived in an old duplex in the lower unit. One day, I noticed our internet had cut out and nothing I did seemed to get it working again. I decided to follow the cable to see if there was something wrong there. It led me into the basement and stopped at a door that I had never noticed before, since I only went to the basement to do laundry. The upper tenant barely went down there at all. I opened the door and inside is an entirely separate unit where someone clearly must have rented years ago. I look closer. I see that all the floors and walls are charred, like there'd been some sort of fire at some point. And scattered on the floor was the creepiest array of objects. I still don't really know how to make sense of it. The floor is covered in baby toys, like not old looking or burned, just scattered everywhere. There's also a few photos of people on the floor, but these are all burned, so I can't see who they are. The creepiest thing I found on the floor, though, was an unopened letter sent to my address, postmarked from 1994. I'm a snoop, so obviously I opened it. It's very brief, but it basically was like, I hope all is well. I'm praying very hard for your baby. Sincerely, Father Frank. I could be wrong about the exact name, but it was definitely Father something. I got out of there and called my internet provider, who sent a guy out to see what was up. He came over, did something to turn it back on. And when I was like, hey, why did that happen? Is there an outage or something? He was like, I don't know, man. That was kind of weird. This all happened on Halloween, so still just creeps me out so much. Halloween night, a good 17 years ago, I was walking with my two best friends, Jess and Dana, on our way to a party at one of the houses deep in the suburbs, one where you had to walk a good 15 minutes from anywhere lit. The moon was high, and the only light came from the occasional jack-o'-lantern. It was almost unnaturally dark, the kind of darkness that had you watching your back, even in our slightly inebriated state. We were laughing, making fun of each other's costumes, trying to act like we weren't a little freaked out by how quiet everything was. No kids, no trick-or-treaters, just us and the empty road. We'd been walking for maybe 10 minutes when Dana stopped dead in her tracks. I nearly bumped into her, and when I looked up to see what she was staring at, my stomach turned. There was a kid standing in the middle of the road. He couldn't have been more than 8 or 9. He was wearing one of those cheap plastic masks to cover his face. His clothes were strange, too, like he'd thrown on an old-fashioned suit from a thrift store. But what really freaked me out was how still he was. He just stood there, not moving or saying anything. Where did he come from? Jess was whispering to us. None of us had seen him approach. It was like he'd just appeared. Dana took a step forward. Hey, are you okay? Are you lost? The kid didn't answer. He didn't move. His head tilted just slightly, like he was listening, but his eyes, what little we could see under the mask, never blinked. There was something wrong about him, something off, but none of us could quite put our finger on it. At least we couldn't say it. We exchanged uneasy glances. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. We should just go, Jess muttered, tugging at my sleeve. This is creepy. But Dana was already walking towards him. Hey, buddy, it's okay. We're not going to hurt you. As she approached, the kid started moving, but not the way I expected. He stepped back, not a full step, more like a shuffle. His movements were jerky. Every time Dana moved closer, he retreated further into the darkness. I remember Jess asking me if this kid was leading us somewhere. She seemed scared. Dana stopped about 10 feet from the kid. "Look, if you're scared, we can help you. Do you live around here?" Again, no response, just that eerie backward shuffle. He was barely lit by the glow of a distant porch light, and it was like he was leading us further into the shadows. "I don't like this," Jess said again. "We need to go, now." But Dana didn't listen. She took another step forward, and that's when it happened. Out of nowhere, something lunged from the shadows behind the kid. I barely registered what it was, just a blur of movement, a low growl, and suddenly, it had Jess and me by the arms. I screamed. Jess shrieked louder, and we both struggled against its grip. It was strong, unbelievably strong, like iron fingers digging into my skin. I couldn't even see it clearly, just flashes of a distorted face. Was it a mask, a person? No idea. I was screaming, "Dana, Dana," but she was frozen. Her eyes locked on the kid, who was now just watching, standing eerily still as Jess and I were dragged towards darkness. "Dana," Jess cried out, trying to kick whatever had her, but it was useless. The thing, it was pulling relentlessly, dragging us backwards, inch by inch. We didn't stand a chance. It felt like we were being pulled towards something worse. I don't know about Jess, but I thought we were going to die. Finally, Dana snapped out of her trance. She ran forward, grabbing Jess's arm, trying to pull her free, telling whatever it was to let her go. Her voice was shaking, but it was loud. She kicked at some shadowy figure, landing a blow, and it recoiled, just for a second. But in that second, it loosened its grip on Jess. She broke free. I kicked as hard as I could, hitting something solid. Suddenly, I was free too. We stumbled backwards, gasping for air, and that's when I saw it. If it was a person, it had a misshapen face, its eyes too wide, its mouth. It was like no mask or face I'd ever seen. And then just as quickly as it had appeared, it melted away. Gone. We didn't wait to see what would happen next. We ran, all three of us, sprinting down the road without looking back. At least I didn't. My heart was literally in my ears, my legs burned, but I didn't stop running. I could hear Jess crying, Dana's frantic breath. I couldn't think. All I could see was that thing in the dark, pulling us into who knows what. When we finally reached the lights of the next street, we collapsed onto the sidewalk, all of us gasping for breath, clutching each other like we'd barely escaped drowning. I looked back down the road. There was nothing. No kid. No shadowy figure. Just an empty street. "Where did he go?" Dana whispered. "The kid." Jess just shook her head as tears were streaming down her face. He wasn't a kid. He wasn't. The three of us never talked about it again. We made it to the party eventually, trying to laugh it off, but none of us were the same after that. Not on Halloween. Every Halloween since, I've just felt something's off. This happened several years ago, the night before Halloween. I'd driven down to visit my cousin in southern New Jersey, near the Pine Barrens. a place notorious for strange happenings, but also a good time. We were always drawn to the spookier side of things, so naturally the woods seemed like the perfect place to take a pre-Halloween night walk. We started off by wandering down a small trail. It was the kind that looked like it'd been forgotten, or at least it wasn't the most traveled path. The deeper we went, the more the woods seemed to come alive. I always love when the wind rustles through the trees, creating odd whispers. But it wasn't just the trees or the wind that was strange out there. I began to feel watched. I remember asking my cousin if she thought we should turn back. I was half joking, but I was uneasy. My cousin laughed it off, always the fearless one, telling me it's just the woods. I really did try to shake it off, but something felt wrong. It wasn't just the oppressive silence that had now settled around us. It was the faint smell, like burnt herbs or something older. And then we saw a woman. At first, she seemed like a shadow moving between the trees, but as we drew closer, the figure became clearer, and it was an old woman, hunched and weathered, her gray hair hanging matted strands around her face. She was standing in the middle of the path. Her eyes were fixed on us as though she'd been waiting. Lost? Her voice was low, almost guttural, with an accent I couldn't quite place. I looked at my cousin. She'd gone unnaturally still. We're fine. Just passing through, my cousin said, but the words came out shaky. The woman didn't move. She didn't blink. She was draped in a tattered cloak that looked ancient. The fabric was swirling around her feet, despite the still air. You should not be here, she rasped, taking a step closer to us. Her face was gaunt. Her skin, it was pale. Her eyes, they were dark, just so unnaturally empty. These woods are not for the living tonight. Something cold crawled up my spine. This wasn't some old woman warning kids off of her property. There was something wrong with her. At the very least, there was something I didn't understand about her. The air around her felt thick, like the woods themselves were closing in on us. We were just leaving, I managed to say, grabbing my cousin's arm and trying to move, but the old woman stepped into our path further. She reached out. Her bony fingers brushed against my hand, and the moment her skin touched mine, it was like ice had shot through my veins. "Tomorrow is Samhain," she whispered. Her breath was foul and sour. "The veil is thin. The spirits are restless, and so am I." I yanked my hand back from her, but the chill, it lingered. It was crawling up my arm. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like the woods were suffocating me. My cousin finally snapped out of her trance and grabbed my arm. "Let's go," she muttered, but the woman's eyes never left me. We practically ran back to the car, neither of us speaking, but the further we got from the woman, the more I noticed something strange. The trees, the leaves, the very air around us, it was silent. No birds, no wind, no rustling, just a void sound. When we finally reached the car, I glanced back. She was still there. She was standing at the edge of the woods, watching us. But now, there were others, shadowy figures just beyond the tree line, all staring, unmoving. I slammed my door and stopped looking. We didn't talk about it on the drive home. It wasn't until we were back at my cousin's house that we finally spoke. Do you think she was a witch?" my cousin asked. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't answer right away, but the memory of her icy touch was still vivid. "I don't know," I said finally, but the truth was, I think I did know, Deep down, I knew that we'd encountered something that night that wasn't just a strange old woman wandering in the woods. The way she approached us, the way she spoke of Samhain, it wasn't natural. And when I looked at my hand where she touched me, I saw a faint mark, like a burn that hadn't quite healed. A warning, maybe a curse, I thought. That night I didn't sleep. I kept hearing her voice in my head over and over. The veil is thin, the spirits are restless, and so am I. I just knew, come Halloween, I wouldn't be anywhere near the Pine Barrens. But something told me she would. When I was 8, my parents and I flew to Philadelphia. My grandmother had died and we were there for her funeral, I believe. Although I was born in Philadelphia, my parents had moved to Wyoming shortly after I was born. They were excited to show me all of their old stomping grounds, high school sweethearts. Both of them grew up in the city. We parked on a random side street and walked up and down the city as they pointed out various landmarks. They seemed nostalgic, reminiscing about their youth. At one point, we stopped for ice cream at a shop where my dad used to take my mom on dates. On the way into the shop, I noticed a homeless man sitting nearby. He wore an eye patch and had no shoes. I felt bad for him, but my parents seemed to pretend he wasn't there. After we got our cones and left the shop, I told myself not to look at him again, but my undiagnosed ADHD made it impossible to resist. It was like trying not to crack your knuckles, knowing the relief that comes after. I couldn't help myself. I glanced. The man was staring directly at me. He was tall and skinny, wearing pants too big for him and a coat riddled with cigarette burns. He stood barefoot on the cold concrete. My parents walked ahead, completely unaware. I knew I shouldn't look again, but the urge was too strong. I turned my shoulder this time to peek back, and to my shock, the homeless man was now just 2 feet behind us. Before I could react, he lunged at me, grabbing the sleeve of my coat. His face was wild, and before I could scream, he started yelling, "You're my girl! You're my girl!" Everything happened in a blur. Within seconds, my dad had tackled the man, throwing punches. The homeless man was tall, taller than my dad, who I'd always thought of as the tallest man ever, a giant. My dad, usually gentle, was transformed by rage. His first punch dropped the man, but the grip on my coat remained. It took several more blows before the man would let go. It was horrifying. I was inches away from my dad's fists as he pummeled this man. When I finally broke free and ran to my mom, my dad was still hitting him. A small crowd had gathered, but no one intervened. It was my mom who finally screamed, "Stop! You're going to kill him!" After that, we hurried back to the car. There was no more sightseeing. We didn't visit anywhere after the funeral either. My parents were visibly shaken, and we left Philadelphia right after the wake. At the reception that was held at my uncle's house, I couldn't focus on the good memories of my grandmother. I was too distracted by the sight of my mom wrapping my dad's bloody hand in gauze. I'm pretty sure he broke his right hand on the homeless man's face that day. As an 8-year-old, I left Philadelphia thinking it was a scary place that I never wanted to visit again. And sure, Philly can be a tough city, but what happened wasn't just a random, unfortunate event. And I found this out about a decade later, completely by chance. Halloween, we were all going through old photos in the kitchen. My parents were showing me their old Halloween costumes. Some of mine as a child were mixed in there, but mostly it was my parents' old photos. I noticed a stack of photos on the kitchen counter. It didn't look like we'd gone through them, so I took them out of the envelope and went to move them to the table. They were high school pictures of my parents with their friends, school events, parties, typical teenage memories. In a lot of these pictures, there was a guy who stood out. He was hard to miss because of his distinct eye patch and his height, taller than my dad. Curious, I brought one of the pictures to my mom and I asked, "Who's this guy?" Her reaction immediately set off alarm bells. She was trying way too hard to act normal. I could tell something was off, so I pressed further and asked, "Did you guys know that homeless man in Philadelphia? Is this him?" My question shattered her composure, and she broke down sobbing, way more than I'd anticipated or ever seen before. I thought she would have brushed it off with a casual, "Yeah, he was just a guy from high school who went down the wrong path," or something like that. But instead, she had a full-blown panic attack. My dad had to help her to the couch to calm her down before she fainted. At that moment, I knew that I'd stumbled onto something much bigger than I'd imagined. Then we were interrupted by trick-or-treaters. But afterwards, I showed my dad the photo. I saw tears well up in his eyes. I was completely confused, wondering what the heck was going on. And that's when they finally told me the truth. The man with the eye patch, the homeless man who grabbed me, was my biological father. All three of them had been friends, best friends in high school. But at some point, my biological dad got heavy into drugs, started showing signs of severe mental illness. He became abusive, and when my mom found out that she was pregnant, she'd already stopped seeing him after he'd tried to strangle her while driving on the freeway. The man who raised me, Jerry, he had stepped in. He was loyal to my mom and helped her escape the toxic relationship, even moving to Wyoming. Over time, their friendship blossomed into love, and he took on the role of my father without hesitation. Well, friends, it appears we've reached the end of tonight's episode. Thanks for joining me. Whether it's your first time or you're a regular, your support means the world over here. Also, a huge thank you to everyone. We just hit 10K subscribers, so all of the work that we're doing and you're doing is working. And I can't thank you enough. We've got brand new episodes every Friday night. Keep those eyes open long enough for those deep sleep videos. Subscribe, tap the bell, and you'll never miss a thing. Big thanks to those who shared their stories, and a huge shout out to our patrons: Tracy S, Mary H, Tamara K, Monica L, ZoeWatt, Chelle B, Donald C, The Dark Cosmos, Marion T, Rat Girl, Alisha S, Erin G, Nikki H, Mr. Revenant, Naz K, Brendon G, Paul T, Nicholas C, Lissane, Arlene F, Adrienne, and TF Parham. If you want to support the Darkest Hour in other ways, consider joining our Patreon. Check out patreon.com/thedarkesthour or click the link in the description to learn more. Do you have stories like these? I'd love to share them. Send them to me, amandadarkesthour@gmail.com, or on the Darkest Hour subreddit, The Darkest Hour YT. Stay spooky.